So, chapter 11 is all about evolution. And whenever I'm talking about evolution, the book does it a little bit differently. So, if you're reading this, this is not going to be in perfect order. But I like to start with evidence. How do we know evolution happens? How do we know evolution is true? So, let's just spend a few minutes talking about that. These are good test questions, by the way. I will almost certainly be asking you about evidence for evolution. So, the diversity of life on Earth is all from evolution. Life started as very, very simple forms and has evolved into what we know, what we have today. I think that's better. So, the first thing to know, the first thing to recognize in this chapter is that the diversity of life on Earth, the reason that there are so many different forms of interesting animals and plants is because of evolution. The first line of evidence for evolution is a pretty straightforward one, and that's the fact that we can see at least portions of the history of life as it has evolved and changed throughout the millennia, throughout the last several billion years. And the more interesting ones here are the fact that we have these transitional fossils, like our friend, my friend, and yours, Archaeopteryx here, that showed a dinosaur that had feathers. These are some of the first transitional feathers that we saw in the fossil record. And we said, aha, dinosaurs are turning into birds. Our friend in the middle here, Australopithecus, and these are primates that are starting to walk upright and get big brains and starting to look like humans. And we have over here our friend, the walking whale, which is a transitional fossil which shows mammals going back into the ocean. So, and perhaps these examples, just these three, are not particularly compelling for you, but here's the sort of the punchline to this. Fossils are fairly difficult to make. Not just everything that dies becomes a fossil. It has to be in very sort of specific conditions. But the fact that you can go through the fossil record and pick out times in evolutionary history where you expect to see the change based on where we are today, and you can go to that rock strata and find a fossil that reflects that is absolutely compelling and is super fascinating and super cool. So, what I mean by this is you can dig down a certain segment of Earth and you can see the rock there and see how deep you are and pretty much figure out how old you're digging. You can also use things like carbon dating, and there are other lines of evidence to prove that, okay, I'm in, 2 million years old or 2 million years back or whatever that is. And you can go and look through the fossil record and say, hey, according to evolutionary history, we should have sort of mammals transitioning back to whales during this time point. And then you go to Pakistan or wherever you can find this fossil. That's where you can find Amblyocetus here, the walking whale. And you can dig this thing up and say, aha, I have found it. This coincides with all of these other lines of evidence. I have a book recommendation. Pretty much read anything by Neil Shubin. Your Inner Fish is a spectacular one if you're curious about exploring the process of evolution in a very approachable sort of way. We also go from simple to complex. So the deeper you dig, the further you go down in the fossil record, the further you go into the soil, the simpler the life forms are. So the oldest fossils that we're aware of are bacteria, or at least evidence of bacteria. Bacteria don't leave fossils, they just leave sort of impressions or evidence of them having existed. But the older you are in the fossil record, the simpler things tend to be, and you can track the evolutionary progress through time using the fossil record. The next line of evidence is this gross looking picture of a snake. And what this is showing is this fact that a snake has a pelvis and a femur. I know you guys are fairly new to biology, but I'm not sure if you're aware of this. Snakes don't have legs. So the fact that, and this is not all snakes, by the way, this is only certain categories of, there's only certain categories of snakes, but they have leg bones. They have a pelvis. Why on earth does a snake need a pelvis? Why does a snake have leg bones even though they don't walk? And the answer to that is these are just the evolutionary vestiges of snakes. These are vestiges of the snake's evolutionary history, and that's why we call them vestigial structures. Okay, these are things that are beginning to erode because of the evolutionary process. Basically, the snake has not needed these things it's not needed a pelvis for millions of years, and it's starting to evolve away. I have another example here. The whale's pelvis, and you can kind of see how absurd it looks in this whale. But the point here being these vestigial structures are things that are becoming less and less necessary for these organisms to survive because of where they live. Because whales, this whale, lives in the ocean. It doesn't need a pelvis, and so this pelvis is starting to go away, but it's not all the way gone yet. And so it still has this sort of relic from when this whale, back in its evolutionary history, when its ancestors were walking around on land. The next line of evidence is homology, or homology, or homologs. Homolog meaning that it has same origin. Okay, so these homologous structures, the reason that our arms are set up so similarly to these other organisms is because of homology. We came from the same place, so it makes a lot of sense that we look similar to one another. When I was learning this stuff, never found this particular example to be compelling, at least when I was first going in. It was just kind of like, okay, our limbs look similar, who cares, right? But what's more compelling is the fact that medicine exists. The fact that you can treat a mouse with an experimental drug and have that potentially translate into human beings. Or the fact that you can take part of a pig's heart valve and put it into a human being. The reason that you can do that is because we came from the same places, so we have similar things going on inside of our bodies. If there was no common origin, if mice and human beings were not related to one another, what would be the point of using them for drug trials? If they were completely separate, if we didn't come from the same spot, it wouldn't be useful at all. You wouldn't be able to put pig heart valves into humans. You wouldn't be able to, like we talked about in chapter 10, you wouldn't be able to grow human proteins from bacteria. So homologous structure, super, super compelling evidence for evolution. So the next line of evidence, and the one that should hopefully really seal it for you if you're not into fossils, if you're not into vestigial structures, if you don't think homology is relevant, genetics is this one totally seals the deal, okay? Darwin didn't know about any of these things. He was contemporaries with Gregor Mendel, certainly. They worked at the same time, but neither of them understood how chromosomes work, even. None of them understood that we have these little segments of DNA where they're little letters that code for mRNA, and that it's eventually turned into protein. They didn't know the central dogma of biology, so you guys should feel good. You know more than Darwin, and you know more than Gregor Mendel. But the reason, or one of the reasons that genetics is compelling, at least for me, is you have these two butterflies, and full disclosure, these are butterflies from my research. But you have these two butterflies, and somebody's, probably 100 years ago or so said, hey, those two things, they live in a similar area. They have these similar morphological characteristics. They have these similar spots on them. They're probably related to one another. And if you now, fast forward 100 years into the future, you can actually take and look at the genomes. You can look at the actual DNA of these two organisms and say, yes, they are very, very similar to one another. So similar, in fact, that it's pretty apparent that they have a common origin. They have common ancestry. The reason that these two things have such similar genetic sequences is because they came from the same place. And if you look at other genes within these two organisms, you can find the same things in human beings. There's a researcher at the University of Pacific who is studying sponges in part. Dr. Ajna Rivera looks at sponges and how they fit into evolution. And sponges have the genes for eyeballs. And again, you guys are new to biology. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but sponges don't have eyes. I'm getting on a tangent, but the point here being that evolution is absolutely certain. It is a fact. There are many lines of evidence, and I'm not going to be able to go deeply into any of them in a short video like this, but evolution is a fact, and what I need you to know is that the lines of evidence for it are the fossil record, transitional fossils, and the fact that we go from simple to more complex things. We have vestigial structures, or structures that are evolving away but leaving vestiges of their evolutionary past. So, leg bones on snakes, organisms that have evolved beyond the ability to see. They can't see anymore, but they still have eyes. What do you need eyes for if you can't see? You don't. You just haven't evolved them away yet. Where am I? Homologous structures, or the fact that you can look at a chimpanzee, which is one of it's our most recent. They're our closest living relative. They're the closest living relative to human beings. But the fact that you can look at a chimpanzee and see a face, and you see arms, and you can see that it has many of the same structures as a human being, because of course it does. It's our closest living relative. And then, when we get to modernity and we wind up in genetics, you can actually look at the genomes of these things. And you can say, I hypothesize that human beings are very closely related to chimpanzees. Oh, look, our genetics are incredibly similar. When you physically look at our genes, they're quite alike. And then you can hypothesize, well, I think we're also closely related to monkeys, but certainly not as close as chimpanzees. You can look at the genetics of those as well and discover that, yes, our genes are still similar. They're not as similar as they were to the chimpanzees, but they're still quite similar. So, all of these lines all of these are lines of evidence for evolution, and there are things that I would like you to know, and they will be on the exam and some quizzes coming up.